A few weeks ago, Laowa reached out to me and asked me if I would like to review their brand new 28mm f1.2 manual focus lens. And although I don't shoot a lot with manual lenses nowadays, I was intrigued by this lens's small form factor and its super wide aperture, and those combined with the 28mm focal length, I thought would make this a very fun lens for travel and street photography. The one I have here is for the Sony E-mount, but I guess one of the benefits of being a manual focus lens is that it can pretty much work with any lens mount without too much technical limitations, and it also comes in the Canon RF mount and the Nikon Z mount and also the Leica L mount as well. And the first thing that stood out to me when I received the lens was the excellent build quality. And I actually don't have a ton of experience with Laowa lenses prior to this, but their lenses always seemed like they were built really well and felt much more expensive than they actually are. And despite being a 1.2 lens, the size and weight of this lens are quite manageable, which is important for travel and street photography. Here it is next to the Sony 35mm f1.8, which is a very small lens, but as you can see, they are very similar. It's 562 grams, and for such a small size, it's actually on the heavier side because, as you can probably see, there's a lot of metal being used here. It feels quite dense and expensive. It feels very nice. The rectangular hood comes attached on the lens out of the box, and the cover actually slides on top of the hood. So I thought this was permanently glued on there, but a few days later, I found out that you can actually twist it off and you can attach a 62mm filter on it. And perhaps most importantly, on a manual focus lens, the focus ring is very well dampened and it feels very nice as well. The throw's not too long and the markings on the lens are very easy to read but not too distracting to look at. And then there's the aperture ring, which goes from f1.2 to f16, and you can feel the subtle clicks as you turn the ring, which is quite satisfying. But you can also disable it with a switch on the side, which might be useful if you're a video shooter. So overall, no complaints about the hardware and the design, not just because of the build quality and the metal construction, but there's something so satisfying about using a lens that's so mechanical and analog. I had a lot of fun shooting with this lens. So with that, let's take a look at some images. First, let me start with everything that I like about this lens, and there is a lot to like about this lens. This lens is sharp, even at 1.2. I mean, it did take some getting used to shooting at 1.2 without autofocus because, you know, when I get my hands on a 1.2 lens, I'm going to start shooting everything at 1.2 just to see how the images come out. And I totally forgot about this a long time ago, but if you have a Sony camera, make sure your focus peaking level is set to low, not high, and because I did realize that the high mode is completely useless. I didn't even know why that mode exists. But anyway, once I got that sorted out and actually started nailing focus, I was surprised by how sharp it was. And these images were taken with my A7 IV, not the A7R5, and they're so clean, razor sharp from corner to corner. I was very impressed. And even at 28mm, you can get some really amazing subject separation at 1.2, and the way this lens renders out of focus areas is quite interesting. It walks this fine line between making them very busy and distracting and rendering them in a unique and artistic way that some vintage lenses do. And I guess what makes this lens not quite like a vintage lens is that it's a lot sharper than most vintage lenses. But overall, it handled extremely busy backgrounds really well, and with its 13 aperture blades, the bokeh balls looked pretty even throughout the frame and didn't create any distracting shapes when I stepped it down. And it also handled flares and color fringing reasonably well. Here are some worst case examples while shooting directly into the sun, and even then, it's actually not too bad, and in most cases, they were hardly noticeable. Here's a video example, and again, pretty good. not much else to say there. While shooting with this lens for about 3 weeks, this was the only example where I saw some purple fringing, and this photo was specifically shot to create chromatic aberration, shot at 1.2 against a pretty harsh light. So I think it's pretty reasonable to say that it's not going to be an issue 99% of the time because I didn't notice it anywhere else. In a control test, as expected, the images were very sharp, and I also noticed that the distortion was quite minimal, which is a bit of a rarity nowadays because a lot of the newer lenses tend to depend on software correction. And at 1.2, I guess you do lose a bit of contrast, which I didn't notice in real-world examples. But the good news is, as you can see, you're really not giving up any sharpness, and as you step it down, the contrast does improve quite a bit from 1.4 and on, but this lens is sharp at pretty much any aperture all the way down to f/16. So, is there anything I don't like about this lens? Well, not really, but if I could be really nitpicky, I could think of one thing, and that is, I don't even want to call this a negative because they're not really selling this as a macro lens, but the minimum focusing distance is kind of on the longer side. It's 50 centimeters, which is roughly 20 inches, which isn't like ridiculous, but it always catches me off guard because it's so fun to shoot this lens at 1.2 in close range, but then I always find myself having to step back a little bit. But then again, once you do find the focus, it is very sharp even at that minimum distance, so I really can't complain about this too much. So by now, you're probably thinking, well, how much is this gonna cost? When I first started testing this lens, they didn't have the pricing quite finalized yet. So I had been thinking a lot about what they might charge for this because, there's no point of me liking everything if no one's gonna buy it because it's too expensive. And considering its build quality and the optical performance and the 1.2 aperture, but also being a manual focus lens, I was expecting about $700. That seemed like a reasonable and realistic amount, and any more would feel too expensive. And they actually just got back to me last night and told me that the US pricing will be $599, so about $100 cheaper than what I expected, so I was pleasantly surprised again. So to sum it all up, this is a very fun lens to use in a variety of situations. But it's not just for the fun either. The optics are good enough for any sort of professional use. Its size is great for travel. It's built like a tank. And I think the adjustable aperture ring and the filter thread and the lack of distortion would make this a great lens for video shooters as well. Not just for full frame, but for APS-C cameras as well. And also if you like to shoot in Super 35 modes, because it's a great focal length for that. All for the price of an entry-level prime. So for that reason, I would highly recommend this lens to anybody. So that's going to be it for me today. Thank you for watching. And if you have any more questions about this lens, just leave a comment down below and I'll try to get to them all. And I will see you on the next video. Bye-bye.